Look, I am going to be straight with you. Something feels deeply off right now, and you know it. This is not just your usual social media panic or the typical world is ending headlines that we see every day. I am talking about something structural, something fundamental. It feels as if we are all standing in the middle of a massive frozen lake and we can hear the ice cracking beneath our feet. We can feel the vibrations in the soles of our boots, but nobody in power wants to acknowledge the sound. For years, we have sensed that the institutions we once trusted are failing. The economy feels like a house of cards. The political landscape looks like a battlefield of radical ideologies. And the very fabric of our society seems to be tearing at the seams. You might think this is random chaos, but what if I told you that this exact moment was predicted with chilling accuracy nearly 30 years ago? In 1997, two historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe published a book that changed how we view the passage of time. They did not use crystal balls or mystical prophecies. They used the cold hard data of 5 centuries of Anglo-American history. They discovered that history is not a linear march of progress, but a series of repeating cycles. They called these cycles saecula, and each one lasts roughly the length of a long human life, about 80 to 100 years. Within these cycles, there are 4 distinct seasons, or turnings. They warned that by the mid-2000s, the United States and the wider world would enter a period of immense peril, a crisis that would rival the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Great Depression. They called this the fourth turning. According to their calculations, this crisis would last about 20 years. If you do the math, starting from the financial collapse of 2008, that brings us exactly to where we are today. 2025 is not just another year on the calendar. It is the projected climax of the entire 80-year cycle. This is the moment when the ice finally gives way. This is the moment when the old order must either fundamentally transform or face total collapse. We are witnessing the death of an era and the painful birth of something entirely new. In this video, we are going to dive deep into why 2025 is the ultimate inflection point for your finances, your family, and your future. We will look at the hard economic data, the generational shifts, and the historical patterns that prove we are in the end game of the fourth turning. This is a serious deep dive for those who want to understand the engine of history rather than just being victims of it. We are going to explore the mechanics of this cycle and explain why the world feels so apocalyptic right now. But more importantly, we will discuss what happens when the turning finally turns and the new dawn begins. Put your phone on silent and pay close attention because the next 30 minutes will change how you view everything happening in the news today. The clock is ticking toward midnight, and we are about to find out what lies on the other side. To understand why 2025 is so pivotal, we must first understand the engine that drives history. Most people believe that history is a straight line moving from the past toward an infinite future, or that it is just a series of random accidents. But the theory of the 4 turnings suggests something much more profound. History is seasonal. Just as nature moves through spring, summer, autumn, and winter, human society moves through a predictable cycle of 4 stages. This cycle is called a saeculum, which is a Latin word meaning a long human life. It spans roughly 80 to 100 years and is composed of 4 turnings that each last about 20 to 22 years. The first turning is the high. This is the spring of the saeculum. It is a period of strong institutions and weak individualism. Society is confident about its direction, and people want to build things together. There is a great sense of community, and the government is generally trusted to solve big problems. The second turning is the awakening. This is the summer. It is a time when people begin to feel that the strong institutions of the high are too stifling or soul-crushing. It is a period of spiritual and cultural rebellion where individuals focus on personal autonomy and values rather than civic duty. The third turning is the unraveling. This is the autumn. The mood of the country becomes individualistic and cynical. Institutions become weak and distrusted, while individualism is at its peak. People stop caring about the collective good and focus on their own interests. This is a time of great decay when the foundations of society begin to rot, but the weather is still pleasant enough that most people ignore the smell. Finally, we arrive at the fourth turning, which is the crisis. This is the winter. It is a period of total upheaval where the old institutions collapse and the entire social order is torn down and rebuilt from scratch. This cycle is driven by the way different generations react to the world they are born into. Each generation is shaped by the turning of their childhood, and in turn they create the next turning as they move into midlife and old age. This creates a self-perpetuating rhythm that has repeated for over 5 centuries. Strauss and Howe tracked this pattern back to the 15th century and found that every 80 to 100 years a major crisis occurs that forces society to redefine itself. The reason 2025 is the eye of the storm is because we are currently at the end of the 4th stage of the cycle that began after World War II. The winter is here and it is reaching its coldest point. In this stage, the problems that were ignored during the unraveling can no longer be pushed aside. Debt levels that seemed manageable suddenly become existential threats. Political disagreements that used to be settled with a handshake turn into bitter tribal warfare. The theory tells us that we cannot avoid this phase. Just as you cannot skip winter, you cannot skip a fourth turning. You can only prepare for the transition. We are now living through the final years of the current saeculum. The old world built in 1945 is dying, and the new world is waiting to be born. In the next sections, we will look at how we got here and why the economic and social signals are all pointing to a massive reset in 2025. To understand our current crisis, we must look back at the beginning of this 80-year cycle. The first turning of our current saeculum began in 1946, immediately after the victory of World War II. This was the high, an era of unprecedented unity and institutional strength. During this period, the United States was the undisputed global leader. The middle class was expanding at a rate never seen before in human history. We built the interstate highway system, we created the Bretton Woods financial order, and we believed that through collective action, we could conquer any challenge. Trust in government was at an all-time high, with over 70% of the population believing that the leaders in Washington did what was right most of the time. This was the spring of our cycle, where the foundations of the modern world were poured in concrete. The generation born into this stable world was the baby boomers. Because they grew up in a world of strict conformity and strong institutions, they began to feel that something was missing. They did not want the picket fence and the corporate life of their parents. By the mid-1960s, the cycle shifted into the second turning, which is the awakening. This was the summer of the saeculum. This period was defined by the consciousness revolution, the civil rights movement, and the anti-war protests. It was a time when the spiritual and individual needs of the person were placed above the needs of the institution. From 1964 to 1984, the culture was on fire. People were questioning authority and rejecting the social contracts of the high. While the economy was still growing, the social fabric was beginning to stretch. The boomers were the young prophets of this era, demanding moral purity and personal expression. They were not interested in building better roads or stronger banks. They were interested in the soul and the self. This period was essential for social progress, but it began the process of weakening the very institutions that provided the stability of the previous era. By the time we reached the end of the awakening, the collective sense of purpose was gone. The unity of the post-war years had been replaced by a focus on the individual. This shift is critical because it set the stage for the third turning, where the walls began to crumble from the inside. The boomers who once protested against the system were now moving into positions of power, carrying their moralistic and uncompromising attitudes with them. Meanwhile, a new generation known as Generation X was being raised in the shadow of this cultural chaos. They were the children of divorce and latchkey homes, growing up in a world where the institutions were already starting to lose their luster. As we move into the next part, we will see how this focus on the individual during the 80s and 90s led to the Great Unraveling. This was the period where the seeds of the 2025 crisis were truly planted. We will examine how the pursuit of short-term profit and the erosion of community bonds made our current collapse inevitable. The third turning, which historians call the unraveling, began around 1984 and lasted until the global financial crisis of 2008. If the high was spring and the awakening was summer, then the unraveling was the autumn of our cycle. This was a period where the air felt crisp and the colors were beautiful, but beneath the surface the life force was retreating. During these 2 decades, the dominant theme was individualism. The collective spirit that built the post-war world was replaced by a new mantra: greed is good. Society became a collection of individuals rather than a cohesive community. During this era, the institutions that were once the pillars of stability became weak and hollowed out. While they still appeared functional on the outside, their internal integrity was rotting. This was the time of the great deregulation of the financial markets. The social contract that promised a stable life in exchange for hard work was quietly rewritten to favor capital over labor. We saw the rise of the megacorporation and the decline of the local community. The economic gap between the ultra-wealthy and the working class began to widen into a canyon. By the year 2000, the top 1% of Americans held more wealth than the entire middle class, but because the stock market was booming and credit was easy to obtain, most people chose to ignore the warning signs. This was also the era of Generation X. Born during the chaos of the awakening, they grew up as the nomad generation. They were cynical, pragmatic, and deeply skeptical of the grand promises made by the boomer prophets. While the boomers were fighting culture wars in the halls of power, Gen X was busy surviving in an increasingly fragmented world. They saw the institutions failing and decided to rely only on themselves. This lack of faith in the system meant that nobody was invested in maintaining the foundations. We were living on the accumulated capital of our grandparents, but we were not making any new deposits into the social or economic bank. Politically, the unraveling was defined by a shift toward bitter partisanship. The shared reality of the post-war years vanished as cable news and the early internet began to sort people into ideological silos. We stopped viewing our political opponents as neighbors with different ideas and started viewing them as enemies of the state. Because life was still relatively comfortable during the 90s and early 2000s, there was no urgency to fix the structural flaws. We pushed our problems into the future by taking on massive amounts of debt, both at the government and personal levels. By the time we reached the mid-2000s, the world was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The institutions were weak, the culture was divided, and the financial system was built on a mountain of unsustainable leverage. The unraveling had done its work. It had dismantled the old order without building anything to replace it. In 2008, the spark finally arrived in the form of the subprime mortgage collapse. The autumn was over and the first cold winds of the fourth turning began to howl. The fourth turning began in 2008 with the global financial collapse, and we have been living in its shadow ever since. This is the winter of history. It is a period of crisis where the survival of the nation and the global order is put at risk. In a fourth turning, the old institutions that were hollowed out during the unraveling finally face a test they cannot pass. Think back to the events of the last 17 years. The Great Recession of 2008 was not just a market correction, it was a signal that the entire financial architecture of the world was fundamentally broken. To save the system, the central banks had to print trillions of dollars, creating a debt bubble so large that it can never be fully repaid. But the crisis did not stop at the banks. It spread into our politics and our social fabric. In 2016, we saw a massive populist uprising that shattered the traditional political parties. People were tired of being lied to by an elite class that seemed disconnected from the struggles of everyday life. Then in 2020, the world was hit by a global pandemic that served as a stress test for every government on Earth. We saw that our supply chains were fragile, our healthcare systems were overstretched, and our societies were so divided that we could not even agree on basic facts. This is exactly what Strauss-Howe predicted. They said that, during a fourth turning, a series of catalysts would occur that would eventually lead to a great climax. We are now in the late stages of this crisis period. If you look at the historical data, the fourth turning usually lasts around 20 to 22 years. From 2008 to 2025 is exactly 17 years. This means we are entering the final act. This is the stage where the pressure becomes unbearable. In previous fourth turnings, this was the moment of the Revolutionary War, the peak of the Civil War, and the height of World War II. These were not just bad years, they were moments where the entire world changed overnight. What makes this period so dangerous is the total loss of trust. According to recent surveys, trust in the media, the government, and the justice system has reached all-time lows. When people lose faith in institutions, they stop following the rules. This leads to the chaos we see in our streets and the vitriol we see on our screens. The fourth turning is a time of extreme polarization where compromise is seen as treason. We are no longer arguing about policy, we are arguing about the very nature of reality. 2025 stands as the projected climax because the cycles of debt, politics, and social unrest are all converging at the same time. The ice is not just cracking anymore, it is shattering. The system is trying to hold itself together with emergency measures, but you cannot fight a winter of history with temporary fixes. Something has to give. As we move into the next section, we will look at the hard financial numbers that explain why this reset is mathematically inevitable, and why 2025 is the year when the bill finally comes due. As a financial expert, I can tell you that while history is driven by human behavior, it is governed by the cold laws of mathematics. If the fourth turning is the psychological winter, then the current global debt situation is the blizzard that will bury the old world. To understand why 2025 is the breaking point, we must look at the numbers that most politicians and news anchors are too afraid to discuss. In 1929, right before the Great Depression, the total debt to gross domestic product ratio in the United States was around 200%. Today, as we enter 2025, that number has skyrocketed to over 350% when you combine government, corporate, and household debt. The global debt now exceeds $315 trillion. This is a number so large that the human brain can barely comprehend it. To put it simply, there is not enough money in existence to pay back what is owed. We have been living on borrowed time and borrowed prosperity for over 40 years. For the last decade, central banks kept interest rates near zero to keep this massive debt bubble from popping. But in the last few years, the ghost of inflation returned. To fight inflation, interest rates were raised at the fastest pace in history. This has created a lethal trap. When interest rates rise, the cost of servicing that $315 trillion in debt explodes. In 2024, the United States government spent more on interest payments than it did on its entire defense budget. This is a mathematical dead end. By 2025, the interest alone will consume such a large portion of tax revenue that the government will have only two choices. Either default on its promises or print trillions more dollars, which will destroy the value of the currency. We are also seeing a massive bubble in asset prices. From housing to the stock market, prices have been disconnected from economic reality for years. The price-to-earnings ratio of the stock market is at levels only seen before the crashes of 1929 and 2000. Meanwhile, the average person cannot afford a home in most major cities. This is the definition of an unsustainable system. When the bottom 50% of the population feels that the game is rigged and they can no longer afford the basic necessities of life, the social contract dissolves. 2025 is the year when these cycles converge. We have the end of a long-term debt cycle, a peak in political polarization, and the climax of the fourth turning. In previous crises, this was the moment when the monetary system was completely reset. In 1933, it was the confiscation of gold and the devaluing of the dollar. In 1944, it was the Bretton Woods Agreement. In 1971, it was the end of the gold standard. The data suggests that another reset is coming. Whether it is a move toward central bank digital currencies, a return to gold-backed assets, or a total collapse of the fiat system, the numbers tell us that the current path ends here. You cannot solve a debt problem with more debt, and you cannot ignore the laws of gravity forever. As we move into the next section, we will look at the people behind these numbers and how the struggle between generations will decide who wins and who loses in the Great Reset of 2025. To understand how the crisis of 2025 will be resolved, we must look at the specific generational archetypes that are currently on the stage of history. Strauss and Howe identified 4 repeating personalities that drive the saeculum. Right now we have a unique and volatile combination of these 4 types, and their struggle for control will define the next decade. At the top of the power structure, we have the boomer generation, the prophets. Born during the high, and having led the awakening, they are now in their elder years, but they are not letting go of the reins. Boomers are a values-driven generation. They are moralistic and uncompromising. This is why our politics feels like a holy war. To a prophet generation, compromise is a betrayal of their core values. They are currently clinging to the institutions they inherited, even as those institutions crumble. Their refusal to step aside has created a gerontocracy in Washington, and in the boardrooms of the world where the average age of leaders is the highest it has been in human history. Then we have Generation X, the nomads. Born during the chaos of the awakening, they are the pragmatic survivors. They do not care about the grand ideological battles of the boomers. They just want to know what works. Historically, nomads are the ones who manage the crisis, but they rarely get the credit for it. In 2025, Gen X is in middle management wondering why they are the ones who have to fix the mess that the older generation created. They provide the necessary skepticism that keeps society from flying off the cliffs of idealism. But the most important group in this fourth turning is the millennial generation, the heroes. According to the theory, millennials are the current hero generation, similar to the greatest generation that fought World War II. They were raised during the unraveling as the most protected and scrutinized children in history. Now they are entering their prime years of influence. Heroes are civic-minded, team-oriented, and focused on solving big problems through collective action. While the world currently views millennials as entitled or soft, the theory suggests that they will be the ones to storm the beaches of the upcoming crisis. They will be the ones to build the new institutions and the new social contracts because they have the most to lose and the most energy to invest in a new future. Finally, we have Generation Z, the artists. Born during the crisis, they are growing up in a world of school shootings, pandemics, and economic instability. They are sensitive and process-oriented. Like the silent generation before them, they will become the mediators and the experts who refine the world that the millennials build. The tension in 2025 comes from the fact that the boomer prophets are fighting their final battle while the millennial heroes are just starting to realize their own power. This transition is never peaceful. The older generation wants to preserve the past, while the younger generation needs to create a future. Every previous fourth turning ended when the hero generation successfully navigated the climax of the crisis and established a new order with the support of the other generations. The question for 2025 is whether the millennials are ready to step into their role as the architects of the next high, or if the friction between the old and the young will cause the system to shatter beyond. Repair. Why do we point to 2025 as the specific moment of impact? It is not just a guess based on the 20-year rule of the fourth turning. It is because multiple cycles are reaching their peak at the exact same time. In physics, this is called constructive interference, when 2 or more waves overlap to create a much larger wave. In 2025, we are seeing the overlap of the long-term debt cycle, the generational power shift, and the technological revolution of artificial intelligence. First, consider the political calendar. 2025 follows one of the most contentious election cycles in modern history. Regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, the country is split almost exactly down the middle. One half of the population believes the other half is an existential threat to democracy. This is the classic symptom of a fourth turning climax. The internal pressure has reached a point where the old political machinery can no longer process the conflict. History shows that during these moments, a single event, often a financial shock or a physical conflict, acts as the catalyst that forces a final resolution. Second, we must look at the global stage. The post-war order established in 1945 is exactly 80 years old in 2025. That system was built on the dominance of the United States dollar and the security of global trade routes. Today, that order is being challenged by a multipolar world. Nations like China, Russia, and the BRICS coalition are actively working to build an alternative financial system. This is not just a trade war, it is a fundamental restructuring of how the world operates. If the dollar loses its status as the primary reserve currency in 2025, every economic assumption we have lived with for 80 years will vanish overnight. Third, we have the sudden explosion of artificial intelligence. This is the technological wild card of the fourth turning. While previous crises were resolved through physical labor and industrial mobilization, this crisis is hitting at the level of human intelligence and social organization. By 2025, AI will have reached a level of integration that will begin to displace millions of white-collar jobs and fundamentally alter the concept of truth through deepfakes and algorithmic manipulation. This adds a layer of instability that no previous generation has ever had to face. The climax of a fourth turning is like a forest fire. It is destructive and terrifying, but it is also the only way the forest can clear out the dead wood to allow for new growth. In 2025, we are likely to see a moment of regeneracy. This is the point where the people realize that the old ways are gone and they must work together to survive. It is the moment when the hero generation stops complaining about the system and starts building a new one. This could take the form of a new constitutional convention, a total digital currency reset, or a new global treaty. Whatever form it takes, the result will be a world that looks nothing like the world of 2024. We are at the point of no return. The climax is not coming, it is here. The most important thing to remember about a fourth turning is that it is not the end of the world. It is the end of a world. History shows us that while the climax of a crisis is painful, it is also the moment when society finds its greatest strength. This is what historians call regeneracy. It is the point where the internal divisions of the unraveling are finally cast aside because the external threat or the internal collapse becomes so great that separate survival is no longer an option. Think about the previous cycles in American history. In the 1700s, the colonies were divided and disorganized. But as the revolutionary crisis reached its peak, they realized they had to become the United States or remain subjects of the crown. Out of that chaos, they created a constitution that has lasted over 200 years. In the 1860s, the nation was literally ripping itself apart in the Civil War. It was the bloodiest period in our history. Yet from that fire emerged a unified country with a destroyed slave economy that was rebuilt into an industrial powerhouse. Then look at the last fourth turning, the Great Depression and World War II. In the early 1930s, people were starving and the financial system was a total wreck. Many believed that democracy and capitalism were dead. But under the pressure of the crisis, the people mobilized. They built the Hoover Dam, they fought a two-front global war, and they created the middle-class prosperity that we have enjoyed for decades. Each time, the situation looked hopeless. Each time, people thought it was the end. And each time, we emerged stronger, more unified, and with a new sense of purpose. This is the hopeful message of the theory. The crisis is the birth canal of the next high. By 2025, the dead wood of our current system will be cleared away. The unsustainable debt, the gridlocked politics, and the broken social contracts will be forced into a resolution. This is when the hero generation takes the lead. They will not be building on the old foundations, they will be pouring new ones. We will likely see a massive period of infrastructure building a total reform of the education system and a new financial architecture that is designed for the 21st century rather than the 20th. The regeneracy happens when we stop asking what the government can do for us and start asking what we can do for each other. It is the moment when the community bond is restored. In 2025, we may face a dark winter, but history tells us that the sun always rises on a new high. The question is not whether the new dawn will come, but whether you are prepared to be one of the builders of the new world. We are about to enter the most creative and transformative period in modern history. The old rules are breaking so that better ones can be written. We have traveled through 5 centuries of history to arrive at this exact moment. 2025 is the threshold. Behind us lies the broken promises of the unraveling and the chaotic storms of the fourth turning. Ahead of us lies the unknown territory of a new era. If the patterns of the last 500 years hold true, the world you inhabit 5 years from now will be unrecognizable compared to the one you live in today. But this should not be a cause for despair. It is a call to action. History is not something that just happens to you. It is something you participate in. To survive and thrive in the climax of a fourth turning, you must first change your mindset. Stop waiting for the old normal to return. The world of the 1990s and the early 2000s is gone, and it is not coming back. Those who cling to the old way of doing things will be swept away by the current of history. You must become like the nomad generation, pragmatic, skeptical, and adaptable. You must look at the world with clear eyes and accept the reality of the crisis. Financially, this means prioritizing resilience over growth. In a period of institutional reset and currency transformation, tangible assets and diverse income streams are your best defense. Understand that the financial system is undergoing a fundamental restructuring. Do not put all your trust in the promises of a debt-based system that is mathematically hitting its limit. Knowledge is the ultimate currency. Educate yourself on the history of money and the mechanics of the global economy, because the winners of the next high will be those who understood the transition before it happened. Socially, you must invest in your local community. During a fourth turning, when the large institutions fail, the small circles of family, friends, and neighbors become lifeboats. Strength in the coming decade will not come from your social media following or your digital footprint. It will come from the people you can count on in the real world. This is the essence of the Regeneracy. We must rebuild the social fabric from the bottom up. The clock has struck midnight on the old cycle. The ice has shattered, and the turning is turning. We are the generation that gets to decide what the next high will look like. Will it be a world of renewed freedom and prosperity, or a world of centralization and control? The choices you make in 2025 will ripple forward for the next 80 years. You were born for this moment. The hero generation is rising, the pragmatists are managing, and the old prophets are fading. It is time to stop fearing the storm and start learning how to sail. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the engine of history. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel and share this video with those who need to hear the truth about our current era. Leave a comment below and tell me, do you feel the shift happening? And are you ready for what comes next? The winter is here, but the spring is waiting for those who have the courage to build it.